As the financial industry races to compete in a data-driven world, how do you move beyond storing the data and effectively turn rich data sets into actionable insights? In this session, we will explore what technologies are critical to capture data quickly, mine it, and turn it into a story that will boost productivity, improve operations, and seize new market opportunities. For this, I'd like to welcome Ted Meybri, Global Head of Commercial for Pallantier. So, Ted, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Now, Pallantier's tagline is turning data into insights. Talk to us about what insights you can pull out across how many different kinds of industries.
So our platform is deployed across 40 different industries, and we're really agnostic to both the data type inputs and the ultimate outputs for what you want to do with that data. What we've spent a lot of time doing is essentially synthesizing what are the common problems that are agnostic to every industry that any large institution with a lot of different data that they need to utilize to drive their operations need to have solved.
So tell us about the technology. How do you actually find meaning in that data? Because that's the key.
Yeah, so one of the key things that we learned, and frankly learned the hard way, is that you really need to start with the decisions and not the data. Our experience has been that when you start with data, it almost makes the problem impossible to solve. How can I wrangle this massive complexity? How can I turn that into insight? But then most importantly, how do I turn insight into action? And while that looks like the final mile, we actually found that that final mile was not one more step, it was an ocean to cross. And so really baked into the core architecture of the technology is working backwards from decisions. And how can I work backwards from decisions to find the decision architecture of the institutions that we're trying to serve, and then create the software infrastructure that allows those decisions to scale over time, to happen in more coordinated ways across functions, to create an asset that you can learn from that provides the foundation to actually apply AI in meaningful ways for large institutions. But it really comes back to flipping the paradigm on its head of this is not a data problem, this is a decisions problem.
Now, Pallantier has been a fairly controversial company because of privacy concerns. Set the record straight for us. Are you actually taking the data and analyzing data from governments and companies yourself, or are you giving governments and companies the software for them to analyze their own data?
We 100% only provide the software to our partners for them to be able to utilize the software to analyze the data that they have legal access to and control over. So we as Pallantier as an institution control no data. We have no access to that data. We cannot utilize any data across institutions. We are only providing software to our customers for them to be able to use that data, as well as enforce the controls that they need to enforce so that they can be compliant with how that data is utilized.
Now, earlier this year, I spoke to your COO, Shyam Shankar, and he talked about how the pandemic was really a shock to the system for companies, governments, your clients across the board. At this moment in time, has that shock been absorbed? What are companies and governments going through right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things I think we're most proud of is that we were able to really help our partners during the pandemic. I think if you look at and ask them how many of their technology investments actually helped them evolve and adapt to that inherent volatility that was imposed by the shock, what we found was many of our customers essentially reverted to turning those software systems off, putting them on the shelf, saying we will return to those. And really in that moment, when the future sort of arrives, you'd expect that your technology would matter most. And I think we're proud to say that our technology did matter most. Now, as that has sort of worked its way through the system and evolved, I think what we're seeing is that people don't want to go back to how it was before the pandemic. And in fact, the pandemic is sort of realizing and revealing to them that that shock is the same shock that they're actually undergoing every single day. And so you have the macro events now, like major supply chain disruptions, major geopolitical events that are reordering the dependencies across their value chains. But also, if you use the analogy of most software systems are helping them operate better in times of equilibrium. And then you had this moment in time that was a fundamental shock. How can I adapt to and treat that moment in time in its specific nature, meet it where it is? They're now saying, well, that same exact dynamic exists for me across the entirety of my operations every single day. How do I treat every single customer as an individual customer, not as an average across a BI report that says this is what my customers tend to do? How do I treat every single situation when I'm optimizing the allocation of my scarce goods in my supply chain for those given customers in that given moment? And so kind of moving from if we can respond in the specific to a nuanced event in time, like the pandemic, I ought to be able to use software and data to respond to every single one of the decisions that I'm making every single day with that same specificity, that same resiliency, and that same adaptiveness to change.
So can you give us some examples of the kinds of problems certain kinds of companies or industries are trying to solve right now and how you're helping them do it?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you take that same paradigm from the pandemic, one of the things that we helped our financial institution partners with was, how can I start to understand risk of an individual customer when all of my underwriting models that were developed and trained on periods of equilibrium are no longer applicable? Well, I now need to take into account a much broader data asset to understand each individual customer in the context of the macro environment that they operate in, whether that's COVID tracking data, being able to use my own internal rich data assets to reconstruct supply chains and trade corridors and see how that reveals in my own data, to enable me to make really specific decisions that helped me help my customers when they needed it most in the context of the pandemic. They're now then looking at that and saying that same asset is actually an asset that I ought to be using in my day-to-day operations. This gives me fundamental insight to use all of the data that I'm collecting to reimagine my value proposition for my customers, for me to be able to reach into my customers and provide them more of a white glove service to help them manage the complexity and risk in their own businesses. And so it's kind of that compounding nature across these things.
Palantir has for so long worked with big customers, pitched itself as an operating system for the government, for example. So big government agencies, big companies. Is that a maturing market for you now, or is there still room there to grow?
So there's still massive room for us to grow. I think we are just scratching the surface of what our enterprise business is going to look like. But at the same time, I think what a new market for us is those growing companies, smaller companies, companies that are essentially defined by their ambition to recreate the world. And what we're seeing is that those companies are starting to adopt our technology at pace, and in fact are able to utilize it with more ambition, with more pace, because they kind of have a different mental model of, instead of saying to the original question, am I starting with just figuring out how to manage complexity, or am I starting with the proposition of how do I use data to create new and novel value propositions? How can I extend credit to underbanked communities by moving beyond the FICO score? How can I do that in developing nations when I need to think about how data can help me operate in different ways? And so I think what we've started to see is, yes, we continue to focus on and invest in the large enterprises, especially the large enterprises that are operating with urgency to solve problems or to reinvent themselves so they continue to be the dominant players in their industries in 2025 and 2030, but also starting to go and find that smaller companies with equal or greater ambition are able to utilize the software and really accelerate their roadmaps and their goals.
Now, big companies, big government agencies have long track records, sort of know what problems they're trying to solve, whereas earlier stage companies don't have long track records. So how is helping a startup different than helping a bigger company?
Well, I think the primary thing that we've observed is one of the dichotomies is, are you focusing on technology to help you modernize, or are you focusing on technology to help you transform your value proposition? And I think we see in the larger companies, there's a lot of effort and a lot of work to go into essentially replicating the existing architecture, but put it in the cloud. I need to modernize the way that I think about data, and I need to do it on modern technologies. The challenge with that is, if you ask, okay, now that I've implemented those things, I've implemented the big data reference architecture for a large institution, you have to ask, is the business different? Is it now going to win in 2025 or in 2030? Or how can you find ways to say, I need to demand more of my data to create new value propositions to continue to reinvent myself? With the smaller company, you kind of have that from the get-go. They are very focused on, they have urgency, they have the immediate need to generate a novel value proposition. But what they don't have is the scale that the large institutions have. And so while we continue to focus on both, some of the more inventive and creative things that we're doing are coming from our largest institutional partners who, one, have the large data assets that they can use. Two, they have the fundamental human expertise. And I think that's a key thing that's underlooked with these things is the most valuable thing that data can do is start to unlock the real expertise of the humans in these institutions. And so being able to turn those assets, data and human, from things that need to be modernized, you're almost fighting upstream against, to how can I unlock them and create new novel value propositions. We're also starting to see an accelerating rate at which our large customers are operating with the same ambition and speed of our startup customers.
So what's your advice to startups now about how to get the most out of their data and when to start trying to mine that data? Obviously, when you're working at a startup, you've got a lot of different priorities, a lot of different fires you're trying to put out at any given time.
Yeah, well, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head of the key thing is that data cannot be an also-ran. If you're treating data as something that is one of many things to do, or you're essentially saying, well, I ought to implement that same reference architecture that exists in well-developed industry, it's always going to be secondary because it is of secondary importance. When you're treating data only as something to be managed and analyzed, instead of something that is fundamentally the fuel for, is my product good enough? How can I make my product better? Am I communicating that effectively to my customer base? How do I do that in a compounding way? Those things have to be inextricably linked. And if they aren't inextricably linked, well, then our software is probably not the right fit for the business that they're trying to build.
Now, is all data actually useful, or is some data meaningless? I mean, do you ever get your hands on data or help companies get their hands on data that they then throw out because they don't need it, ultimately?
I would say that the substantial amount of data is utterly useless. And I would even go further to say a substantial amount of insight is utterly useless. And so a lot of times the data, you just think about the complexity of it, and I'll give you a concrete example of if you say you're trying to make a field force more effective in running a more reliable telco network. And that telco network, when someone comes to your house to say, my cable's broken, my internet is down. Well, there are about 10 million reasons that could be caused. And a lot of the times I'm going to send someone to your house to fix something that isn't broken because it's somewhere else along that chain of dependencies to get you reliable internet. Now the data there, so you're saying I want to evaluate the context of how effective is my field force in that case. And a lot of the times they're going to fix things that aren't broken. How are you going to measure their effectiveness? How are you going to measure the quality of their training program? How are you going to measure which teams are more effective under which context? And so it kind of comes back to really focusing on what are the decisions that are being made? How do you get the data that is required to make that decision into the hands of the operator at that point in time? And how are you very thoughtful about structuring the output of that decision to create an asset where that data is, one, useful, two, not going to lie to you over time, and three, actually fuel learning that is meaningful in the context of your operations?
In that case, there is a lot of concern about companies collecting too much of our data. Facebook and Google, for example. You have regulators scrutinizing this stuff around the world. Do you think companies like that should be scraping less from us, should be collecting less about us?
So I'm really only focused on what we're doing, and I think there are things there that are broader societal questions that should be decided by broader society about what those things are, making sure that it's very transparent, why the data is collected, under what purposes, how it is used, making sure that there is the demand on the technologies to implement those controls where they are fully transparent and auditable. But we're really focused on helping our partners utilize the data that they have access to that is obvious that they can create better value propositions for their partners.
How important is AI to Palantir and informing the software that will enable a next generation of insights?
So it's incredibly important. We really view it as an asymmetric technology that has the potential to fundamentally transform the way that institutions operate in the same way that nuclear energy could totally transform the defense space and power generation broadly. That said, I think we're very much in the early innings of it and really treating it on the outside of the core decisions that institutions are making. So a lot of the ways that AI is being practically applied is starting with the question, kind of going back to my original statement of, where is there data that might support me being able to train an AI algorithm? What could I get? What kind of predictions could I treat from that data? Okay, now how could I apply it to my core operating principle as a business? And again, at that last moment, you sort of see that, gosh, this isn't that useful. A churn model is very difficult to apply to an operating business with any positive economic return, no matter how good that model is. Same thing with a predictive maintenance algorithm for an engine on an aircraft. You really need to think about meeting the institution where it is. What is its core mission? What is its core value proposition? How do you help the people who are just making decisions that define that value proposition now, informed by data, such that I can start to generate the data to use analytics and AI to help them make those decisions in a more effective way and really go inside out from the core value proposition versus outside in with how can I apply this novel technology.
From a market perspective, you got a lot of investors making a bet on Palantir and this future. One of them is Cathie Wood. Her ARK Invest has a stake. She has a huge retail following. Palantir now has a huge retail following. It's kind of become a meme stock, at least on certain days. Has that been helpful for sales? Has that been a surprise at all as somebody who's operating within the company?
I think everything that happens to us in the external world tends to be a surprise because we're so internally focused. But I think one of the things with our investor following is that we tend to be very respectful of them. And when we see and we talk to the folks in the quote unquote like retail space, they tend to have done significantly more work and actually understand the fundamental value proposition of what we're doing at an intimate level. I think that tends to be tied to our software is really deployed in a heterodox way versus what people expect of SaaS software, with how we have developed it, what the trajectory of the company has been, how we think about it from a decisions versus data point of view. And these are all things that folks who have an outsider's view on just does this make sense versus how well does this adhere to what I expect of a traditional software company tend to actually be willing and capable of learning the things that are actually most important about what generate novel value for Palantir than folks who are coming at it from a how does this fit into my institutional mindset of what I expect.
That said, are there ever any concerns that having the retail interest could be a distraction? You know, for example, on GameStop, on any given day, it's way up or it's way down. That's not necessarily good either.
The missions that we're supporting with our customers make it very hard for us to have any plausible belief that we'll be distracted. When you're focused on staying up all night to figure out how to bootstrap a vaccine distribution network in 4 weeks, you're not looking at the stock price. You aren't looking at Twitter. And our institutions and our partners, the people who do the most important things in the world, they consume us basically in our entirety. And so we remain very focused on just how can we help them. And then on the broader markets, you know, the chips will fall where they may.
On that note, then, there is so much data that's left to be analyzed, and I'm sure a lot that will be thrown out. But as we learn more about kind of the information we already have and the information we'll be able to collect over time, how do you think that'll change certain industries over time? Like today, we're focusing on fintech, for example. How will the finance industry be different 5 to 10 years from now because of what we can learn from what we're already gathering?
Yeah, well, my expectation is that it will be fundamentally different. And I think what you've seen sort of emerging over the last several years is the institutions that are able to use data as fuel for their value proposition versus just exhaust of something to be managed and analyzed have created fundamentally asymmetric returns. It started in the consumer internet, where from a data perspective is actually a much simpler problem. You can define the entirety of your data model. It's very coherent. It's only in that digital domain. But you see the institutions that are able to do that create products that create compounding data assets that are essentially unassailable and nobody can replicate, start to create essentially monopoly returns for themselves. We started to see that move out of the consumer internet into something like the automotive space, where Tesla is able to use data as a fundamental driver on a continuous basis for the product development. And you can see the returns and the sort of rate of innovation happening there. You're starting to see this in the financial services space as well, with the fintechs that are starting to create real scale, because there's a huge amount of opportunity between how data is used to generate value and products and services for the lion's share of consumers and the potential of what that data could do to create more personalized, more robust, more secure solutions for those customers. And if you don't get on that train and you think, let's work backwards from 2025 or 2030, what is this industry going to look like? Is it going to be led by the folks that are using data in this asymmetric way? And our expectation is that it will, and we're very focused on helping our partners be those companies that define this industry in 5 to 10 years.
Fascinating. Well, since we started on the pandemic, I'd like to end there because Palantir is one of many companies that have moved their headquarters as a result of the shift to remote hybrid work, the tumult that the world has been through. Palantir moved its headquarters from Silicon Valley to Denver. You moved from New York to Denver. I'm curious what that transition has been like for the company. What has been gained? Do you feel like anything's been lost? Because we have so many people in our audience right now who are thinking about making the same changes and considering the same potential compromises.
Yeah, so Denver's been great for us. It's been great for me personally. But we as a company are also tend to be, we go where we need to be. And I think the vast majority of our employee base tends to be very close to our customers, making sure we intimately understand what their problems are and how to solve for them. And so that hasn't really changed. The fact that we now need to do it through a screen has created fundamental challenges where I think we've been very proud with the ability that we've been able to operate extremely effectively in time. But one of the biggest challenges and things that we're working at every day is that it is much harder to create the creative environment, the idiosyncratic discovery of new novel people, new novel genius in very spiky ways when you're interacting with the same people through a wall of meetings on a screen. And that is both internally with how do we find the next great software developer who's going to come up with an idea that fundamentally alters the trajectory of our product, as well as do we actually intimately understand our customers' operating environment, not the software we want them to use, but the software they really need to achieve their mission. And I don't think there's any trade-off for being there in person to be able to discover that.
But this is the new normal, right, in your view, and we'll find ways to muddle through these challenges for years to come?
I think we'll find ways to muddle through them, but we have to fight for the things that we've lost as things change and be really honest about that.
All right, that's brutally honest. Ted Mabrey, Global Head of Commercial for Palantir, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing all of your insights with us.